June 6, 1944, 15 hours. Strongpoint, WN-62. Omaha Beach. Inside a concrete bunker overlooking the English Channel, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh methodically cleaned the barrel of his MG-42 machine gun. The motions were slow, practiced, almost ritualistic. In his tunic pocket, he carried a letter from his girlfriend in Mettingen, written in careful handwriting, promising that she would wait for him until the war ended in German victory. "The invasion will be their grave. We will drive them back into the sea within hours." He had written those words to her only 3 days earlier, shortly after a visit from Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel himself. The Desert Fox had peered through Severloh's firing aperture, examined the overlapping fields of fire, and nodded with visible approval. "When they come," Rommel had said, "this beach will become their cemetery." Now, looking through the embrasure, Severloh saw nothing but darkness and a calm, empty sea. The night was quiet, almost peaceful. In 12 hours' time, this same young man would be found sobbing uncontrollably inside the bunker, surrounded by approximately 13,500 spent shell casings, his machine gun barrel warped and scorched from heat, staring at an invasion force so immense that his mind would refuse to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. Severloh would later claim to have inflicted between 10 and 20 casualties. Historians have dismissed this as mathematically impossible, given that total American casualties at Omaha Beach from all causes numbered roughly 400. The true story of German defeat was about to be written not in operational plans or intelligence summaries, but in the stunned testimonies of soldiers who would witness the largest amphibious invasion in human history from the wrong side of the gun sight. The Atlantic Wall stretched nearly 400 kilometers from Norway to the Spanish frontier, a defensive system Nazi propaganda, hailed as the most formidable fortification ever constructed. Along the Normandy coast alone, 58 German divisions of uneven quality manned positions that had consumed approximately 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1-2 million tons of steel. Adolf Hitler himself had declared the defenses impregnable. At Omaha Beach, the preparations seemed to justify such confidence. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the Germans had constructed 8 concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 4 artillery emplacements, 18 anti-tank gun positions, 45 rocket launcher sites, 85 machine gun nests, and 6 mortar pits. The beach itself had been transformed into a carefully engineered killing ground. Some 700 obstacles had been placed in the tidal zone: Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, and wooden stakes, many fitted with teller mines. Inland, an estimated 6.5 million landmines had been laid, though Rommel had demanded 10 times that number. Colonel Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment near Bayeux, calculated the defensive firepower available in his sector. His 4 artillery batteries alone could theoretically deliver 120 rounds per minute onto the beach. When combined with neighboring units, German forces could concentrate enormous firepower on any attempted landing. These calculations, however, rested on a critical assumption: unlimited ammunition. It was an assumption that would soon prove fatal. On June 5th, weather conditions appeared to rule out any invasion. Luftwaffe meteorologist Walter Stuve, stationed in Paris, reported wind speeds of 20 to 25 knots, waves reaching 6 feet, and low cloud cover at just 500 feet. Based on data from U-boats and coastal weather stations, Stuve assured German High Command that the storm would persist for at least 2 more weeks. Confident in this forecast, many senior officers left their posts. Rommel himself departed for Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife's birthday, carrying a pair of gray suede shoes he had purchased in Paris. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, ordered his division commanders to attend war games in Rennes. Even routine naval patrols in the Channel were cancelled due to rough seas. This faith in meteorology became the first catastrophic German miscalculation. Unbeknownst to Stove, the Allies possessed weather stations in Greenland and conducted long-range reconnaissance flights over the Atlantic. These assets detected a brief break in the storm, a narrow, 36-hour window identified by Group Captain James Stagg and seized upon by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, TOR. At 2,315 hours on June 5, German radar stations along the Normandy coast began detecting unusual activity. Freya and Würzburg radar arrays picked up massive aerial formations approaching from the north. To the operators, this initially seemed familiar, another Allied deception raid intended to keep German forces on edge. By 30 hours on June 6, reports began arriving that no longer fit any known pattern. Paratroopers were landing across Normandy. The information was contradictory and confusing. Some units reported landings to the east, others to the west. Some claimed the troops were British, others American. Dummy paratroopers equipped with firecrackers, part of Operations Titanic and Rupert, deepened the chaos. Major Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, was among the first to grasp the gravity of the situation. Awakened by reports of airborne landings near his positions, he immediately requested permission to counterattack. The reply from division headquarters was blunt: "Do not move until the situation becomes clear." Von Luck would later write in his memoirs that he knew at that moment the battle was lost. The paratroopers were clearly marking the flanks for a seaborne landing. Every minute of delay allowed them to consolidate. Yet German forces remained immobilized by their own command structure. June 6, 530 hours. As the first pale light of dawn spread across the Channel, German observers stationed along the Normandy coast began reporting something utterly beyond anything their training had prepared them to witness. From multiple strongpoints came the same stunned descriptions. The sea was no longer empty. The presence of Oberleutnant Werner Pluskat at the coast remains disputed by some historians, including Heinrich Severloh himself, yet several accounts credit him as one of the first officers to report what he saw. What is beyond dispute is that German observers from one end of the coastline to the other stared out in disbelief as the horizon itself appeared to dissolve. The channel was filled from edge to edge with ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Vessels of every conceivable type covered the sea like a vast gray carpet. Massive battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and countless small landing craft advancing in disciplined formation. According to official Allied records, the invasion fleet consisted of 6,939 vessels, 213 warships, 126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary vessels, and 864 merchant ships. It was the largest naval armada ever assembled in human history. For German defenders raised on years of propaganda, portraying the Allies as weak, divided, and incapable of decisive action, the sight was psychologically crushing. Bernhard Frerking, an artillery officer at WNS 62 who would be killed later that day, reportedly told his men that they were watching the entire world arrive on their doorstep. At 535 hours, the naval bombardment began. Nothing in the experience of the German defenders, not the Eastern Front, not the heaviest RAF bombing raids, had prepared them for what followed. Battleships and cruisers unleashed their guns with a violence and precision that exceeded anything previously encountered by the Wehrmacht. The battleship, USS Texas alone, fired 255 14-inch shells at Pointe du Hoc in just 34 minutes, according to records from the U.S. POW, Naval History and Heritage Command. MS Warspite, which opened fire at approximately 500 hours, would deliver more than 315 15-inch shells over the first 2 days of the invasion, including 96 rounds fired at German positions on June 9. The cumulative weight of naval gunfire dwarfed anything the German army had experienced during the war. Veteran accounts preserved in the German Federal Archives describe concrete bunkers, designed to resist any conceivable bombardment, splitting apart under the impact of heavy shells. Men were buried alive, dug out, and buried again as the barrage continued without pause. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. Fortifications in which the defenders had placed absolute faith were disintegrating around them. Structures meant to be permanent were collapsing like sandcastles under the relentless pounding. As the naval guns thundered, the Luftwaffe's response revealed the full extent of Germany's desperation. Oberst Josef Pips Prille, commander of Jagdschwader 26, received orders to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. His reaction, recorded in his wing's war diary, was brutally honest. "What entire force? I have 2 aircraft." The Luftwaffe, which had promised total air superiority over any Allied landing, managed to fly only 319 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew 14,674. According to U.S. Navy Office of Naval Intelligence records, Priller and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, conducted the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches during the morning hours of June 6. Flying their FW-198 fighters, they made a single strafing run over Sword Beach before fleeing under overwhelming Allied fighter cover. 2 aircraft. 1 pass. Against an armada of thousands. This lone symbolic gesture became an enduring image of German impotence. The Knights of the Air, who were supposed to darken the skies over any invasion, had been reduced to a futile act against impossible odds. At 630 hours, the first assault waves reached the beaches. Despite the devastation inflicted by naval gunfire, German defenders emerged from shattered bunkers and manned their surviving positions. Machine guns opened fire. Mortars and artillery joined in. What followed was slaughter on a scale that shocked even veteran soldiers hardened by years of combat. At WNS 62, Heinrich Severloh began firing at approximately 635 hours. His position, one of the few left largely intact by the bombardment, commanded nearly perfect fields of fire across Omaha Beach. In his 2005 memoir, WNS 62, Erinnerungen an Omaha Beach, Severloh wrote that he fired approximately 13,500 rounds over 9 hours of continuous fighting. While Severloh later claimed to have inflicted enormous casualties, historians emphasize that his position, though deadly, was only one element among many contributing to the losses at Omaha. Precise casualty figures attributable to any single gun cannot be verified. What is certain is that his MG-42, firing short bursts at a rate approaching 200 rounds per minute, played a significant role in earning Omaha Beach its grim nickname, Bloody Omaha. As the fighting intensified, German defenders began experiencing what military historians would later describe as material shock, a psychological collapse triggered by exposure to overwhelming, inexhaustible force. No matter how many American, British, or Canadian soldiers were cut down, more continued to arrive. Every destroyed landing craft was replaced by several more. Every silenced machine gun nest was immediately smothered by naval gunfire that appeared limitless. By late morning, reports from coastal strongpoints began to reveal a crisis no defensive plan had anticipated: ammunition shortages. German calculations had been based on repelling a limited landing attempt, not sustaining combat against an invasion of this magnitude. Supply records indicate that many positions stocked for a 3-day engagement exhausted their ammunition reserves within hours. Artillery units suffered the same fate. Batteries that form the backbone of the Atlantic Wall burned through carefully rationed shells at an unsustainable rate. Attempts to resupply them failed almost immediately. Allied fighter bombers patrolled every road, strafing and bombing any movement. By the afternoon of D-Day, some German artillery units were rationed to as few as 4 shells per gun per day. The contrast between German scarcity and Allied abundance was impossible to ignore. German observers recorded with disbelief that American destroyers routinely fired hundreds of shells at single targets. Meanwhile, German gunners were forced to choose which threats justified expending their last remaining rounds. Rommel's Armored Reserve, intended to crush any invasion at the water's edge, remained immobilized during the critical morning hours. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation positioned close enough to intervene, did not receive orders to move until approximately 1,000 hours, nearly 4 hours after the landings began. When the division finally attacked at 16:20 hours, its units advanced between British airborne landing zones toward the coast. According to divisional records, elements reached the shoreline between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer around 1900 hours, making them the only German armored force to reach the coast on D-Day. Their success was fleeting. At 2100 hours, the Panzer crews witnessed the arrival of Operation Mallard, approximately 250 gliders carrying reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne Division. Interpreting this massive airborne movement as a direct threat to their flanks, the division withdrew. By the end of the day, the 21st Panzer Division had lost 54 tanks and armored vehicles, roughly a quarter of its combat strength, in a single day. The counterattack also revealed another unsettling reality. German troops encountered specialized Allied armored vehicles unlike anything they had seen before. Hobarts, funnies, tanks equipped with mine-clearing flails, flamethrowers, bridge-laying apparatus, and other engineering modifications appeared to belong to a different era of warfare altogether. Throughout D-Day, German units faced a threat unprecedented in scale, massive airborne forces operating deep behind their lines. The British 6th Airborne Division, along with the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, created a level of confusion far exceeding their numerical strength. General Friedrich von der Heydte, Germany's most experienced paratroop commander, was present in Normandy during the invasion. In post-war interviews, his professional assessment was unambiguous. The Allied airborne operation, he stated, was everything German airborne operations had never been: massive, coordinated, and continuously supplied. German forces dropped battalions. The Allies dropped divisions. German paratroopers relied on single aircraft for resupply. The Allies employed endless streams of transport planes and gliders. The psychological effect was crippling. Paratroopers seemed to be everywhere. German units refused to move for fear of ambush. Others fired blindly at shadows, sometimes killing their own men. Confusion multiplied existing problems at every level of command. As June 6 wore on, German command and control began to disintegrate entirely. Allied aircraft systematically destroyed communication lines. French resistance units, activated by coded messages broadcast by the BBC, cut telephone cables and sabotaged relay stations. Radio communications were jammed by Allied electronic warfare. General-Lieutenant Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, attempted to coordinate the defense from headquarters at Le Mans. His war diary records growing frustration as contact with frontline units disappeared. By midday, entire divisions had vanished from the communications network. Unit commanders were forced to make decisions in isolation, unaware of the broader situation unfolding around them. As darkness fell on June 6, surviving German defenders assessed the reality of their situation. The Atlantic Wall, declared impregnable, had been breached at multiple points. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist over Normandy. German naval forces had managed to sink the destroyer USS Corrie, but at the cost of 15 E-boats and numerous smaller craft. Generalleutnant Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, which had absorbed the main weight of the British assault, reported to 7th Army Headquarters with brutal clarity. Division combat strength reduced to 35%. All coastal strongpoints lost. Artillery 90% destroyed. Enemy advancing inland. The statistics told the story of total tactical failure, despite individual acts of bravery. In a single day, German forces had suffered losses comparable to those of a major campaign battle, while the Allies continued landing fresh troops as though June 6th were merely the opening chapter, not the climax. Throughout the night of June 6th into the early hours of June 7th, surviving German units attempted to regroup and launch counterattacks. These efforts only confirmed the full extent of Allied superiority. Every movement was detected. Radar tracked columns as they formed. Parachute flares illuminated roads and fields. Artillery and naval gunfire descended with merciless accuracy. Hans von Luck's Panzer Grenadiers, finally released to advance towards Sword Beach under cover of darkness, encountered a scene unlike anything they had known. According to von Luck's memoirs, the night suddenly turned into day. Parachute flares burst overhead, flooding the terrain with white light. Every vehicle and every soldier stood exposed. Shells from Allied destroyers offshore struck with uncanny precision. Von Luck later wrote that his unit lost half its strength without ever seeing an enemy soldier. While German counterattacks bled themselves dry in darkness, Allied reinforcements continued landing without interruption. Engineers began assembling the artificial mulberry harbors directly off the beaches. Supply ships anchored in carefully organized rows. The invasion was no longer a temporary operation. It was becoming permanent infrastructure. As German reinforcements attempted to reach Normandy, they encountered total interdiction. Roads, railways, and bridges were under constant attack. According to Wehrmacht transportation records, units that should have reached the front within a single day took up to 2 weeks. The 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich, stationed near Toulouse, required 17 days to reach Normandy, a journey that should have taken 3. Along the way, it lost approximately 30% of its vehicles to Allied air attacks without firing a single shot at ground forces. The psychological impact of this reality was devastating. If German forces could not even reach the battlefield intact, how could they hope to influence its outcome? The contrast with Allied logistics was staggering. Landing ship tanks discharged entire armored regiments within hours. Within days of D-Day, the Allies were landing approximately 15 tons of supplies per day, more than the entire German army in Normandy consumed in a week. By June 12, German forces in Normandy were approaching psychological collapse. Casualties had reached approximately 26, 0 killed, wounded, or missing, roughly the equivalent of 2 full divisions. Replacements were scarce. Allied strength, by contrast, continued to grow by the hour. Carentan fell on June 12, linking Utah and Omaha beaches into a continuous front. The German paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite troops who had never previously retreated, withdrew in disorder. Their commander reported to higher headquarters with brutal honesty, "My regiment no longer exists as a combat unit. The survivors are psychologically broken." On June 13th, Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann achieved one of the few German tactical successes of the Normandy campaign. According to British military records, his Tiger tank destroyed between 13 and 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 to 15 armored personnel carriers in the Battle of Villers-Bocage within 15 minutes. German propaganda seized upon the engagement as proof that German arms could still prevail. Yet, even this moment of brilliance revealed the futility of the German position. Wittmann's disabled Tiger was replaced only with great difficulty. British losses were replaced within hours. Wittmann himself, credited with 138 confirmed tank kills across all fronts, was killed on August 8 when his Tiger was destroyed. Whether by British gunner Joey Kins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry or by Canadian forces remains disputed. Germany's greatest tank ace fell to an enemy that could afford to trade 10 tanks for one. The fall of Cherbourg on June 26 delivered another crushing psychological blow. The port, fortified over 4 years and garrisoned by 21,000 men, was expected to hold for months. Instead, it fell after just 5 days of serious fighting. Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, who had vowed to defend the city to the last bullet, surrendered. In post-war interrogation, he explained that continued resistance had become meaningless against an enemy with unlimited resources. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, delivered the decisive blow. According to official U.S. Army Air Forces records, the preparatory bombardment involved 500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers, dropping more than 100 tons of bombs onto a sector just 70 yards wide and 500 yards deep. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Division, reported to Army Group B with despair, "My division is annihilated." The psychological effect on the survivors is indescribable. They are no longer soldiers, but broken men. The bombing was so intense that it killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater, despite observing from what was believed to be a safe distance. If American generals were not safe from their own firepower, German soldiers stood no chance. The encirclement that followed became known as the Falaise Pocket. And between August 12 and August 21, it turned Normandy into a graveyard for German forces. According to Allied intelligence assessments, later confirmed by post-war German records, approximately 10 German soldiers were killed inside the pocket, while another 50 were captured. More than 300 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, along with approximately 500 additional vehicles of all types. German soldiers attempting to escape described scenes of near-apocalyptic devastation. Roads were littered with the carcasses of dead horses and the wreckage of burning vehicles. Allied fighter bombers attacked in systematic waves, returning roughly every 20 minutes. Artillery fire fell almost without interruption. The destruction was so complete that many soldiers simply abandoned all attempts to flee, choosing captivity over what they saw as certain death. The final accounting of the Normandy campaign told a story of overwhelming defeat. Between June 6 and August 31, German forces suffered approximately 320 casualties. Around 30 killed, 80 wounded, and 210 missing or captured. Nearly 300 tanks were destroyed, effectively eliminating German armored forces in France. Luftwaffe losses amounted to approximately 127 aircraft. Allied losses, by comparison, totaled roughly 672 casualties, with replacements arriving faster than losses were incurred. Approximately 4 Allied tanks were lost but replaced within weeks. Around 100 aircraft were lost from a total force exceeding 13,000. The disparity revealed a fundamental reality. Germany was engaged in a material war it could not win against an opponent possessing virtually limitless reserves. German professional officers offered some of the most candid assessments of the disaster. General Dietrich von Koltitz, who assumed command in Normandy after Rommel was wounded, reported to the OKDU on August 1 that Allied material superiority was at least 20-1 in artillery, 10-1 in tanks, and absolute in aircraft. Allied forces, he noted, could replace all losses within days. German forces could replace nothing. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote in his 1949 memoirs that Normandy demonstrated with brutal clarity that courage alone could not overcome industrial supremacy. German forces, he argued, had faced an enemy that had mechanized not only warfare, but victory itself. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel provided perhaps the most powerful testament. In his final report to Adolf Hitler on July 15, just 2 days before being severely wounded by Allied aircraft, Rommel wrote that German troops were fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle was nearing its end. The enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and material was beginning to assert itself. He urged Hitler to draw the necessary conclusions without delay. In the language of the German High Command, this was an admission of inevitable defeat. Normandy revealed that the Second World War had become a war of production. German soldiers encountered an American industrial capacity that defied comprehension. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak output. American factories manufactured approximately 96 aircraft in 1944. Allied ammunition expenditure in a single day exceeded Germany's monthly production. One American division consumed more supplies per day than an entire German corps. Hans von Luck, reflecting on Normandy in his memoirs, concluded that modern war was no longer decided by tactics or bravery, but by production. The Americans, he wrote, had transformed war into an industrial process. Victory was manufactured on assembly lines. The German soldiers who survived Normandy were permanently changed. They had witnessed the collapse of everything they had been taught about warfare, racial superiority, and national destiny. Heinrich Severloh, the machine gunner of WNA 62, spent the remainder of his life haunted by June 6. In his 2005 memoir, he described meeting American D-Day veterans years later and realizing that all of them had been young men fed into an industrial slaughterhouse. His 13,500 rounds, he admitted, had meant nothing against endless replacements. Friedrich von der Heydte later became a professor of international law. He wrote that Normandy taught Germany that the era of heroic warriors was over. War had become a matter of industrial capacity, and Germany had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with horses and obsolete dreams. From the German perspective, D-Day was far more than a battlefield defeat. It was a total ideological and psychological collapse. Soldiers who had conquered most of Europe discovered in Normandy that everything they believed about their enemies, their cause, and their own capabilities was catastrophically wrong. They had expected to face weak, divided democracies incapable of sustained effort. Instead, they encountered an alliance that had transformed war into an industrial process of relentless efficiency. What unfolded before them was the arsenal of democracy in full operation. Unlimited ships, aircraft, tanks, and supplies flowing steadily from factories whose output exceeded anything Germany could imagine. The defenders of Normandy learned that modern war was no longer decided primarily by actions on the battlefield, but by production capacity. Victory belonged not to the bravest soldiers, but to the societies capable of manufacturing the greatest volume of material and deploying it with maximum efficiency. Warfare had become a mathematical equation in which industrial statistics outweighed tactical brilliance. Heinrich Severloh began June 6, convinced that any invasion would be repelled within hours. He ended the day surrounded by mountains of empty shell casings, watching endless waves of Allied reinforcements landing on the very beach. His position was meant to dominate. His experience came to symbolize the wider German tragedy in Normandy, moments of tactical success rendered meaningless by strategic impossibility. The beaches of Normandy became not merely a battlefield, but a revelation. German soldiers saw the future of warfare unfold before their eyes, and it did not belong to them. They had brought courage, discipline, and determination. The Allies brought inexhaustible industrial power. In attempting to halt the Allied landings, The German defenders might as well have tried to stop the tide itself. They fired until their gun barrels melted, fought until their ammunition was gone, and then watched as the Allies simply delivered more of everything. More men, more weapons, more ships, more planes. The mathematics of modern war had stripped courage of its decisive power. The German soldiers who faced D-Day learned one of history's harshest lessons. In the age of industrial warfare, nations unable to match their enemy's productive capacity were doomed to defeat, regardless of individual skill or sacrifice. They began June 6 as warriors of the Third Reich and ended it as witnesses to the full, terrifying efficiency of the arsenal of democracy. Their defeat was not only military, but absolute. The Nazi vision of racial superiority and military dominance collided with the reality of Allied industrial supremacy and shattered completely. The invasion they had promised to hurl back into the sea instead swept them aside, carrying away the final illusions of German victory. D-Day, seen from the German side, was not simply the opening of a second front. It was the moment when an entire worldview collapsed under the weight of facts it could no longer deny. The soldiers of Normandy discovered that war in the modern age was not won by heroes on the battlefield, but by factories behind the lines. Not by daring charges, but by production schedules. Not by ideology, but by output. They had faced an enemy that did not merely fight wars, but manufactured victory itself. And against that, nothing they possessed was enough.